All right, Genesis 19. This is not a pretty portion, but it is an important portion for understanding so many things. Excuse me. So what had just happened, right? The Lord, along with two angels apparently, had come to Abraham in chapter 18, and at the end of that chapter, the Lord's like, I'm going to have to go, we're going to inspect Sodom and Gomorrah. The outcry has become great against them. As far as their sin, we're going to go inspect, make sure everything's as we've heard, and if so, there's going to be destruction. Abraham intercedes. What if there's 50 there? What if there's 40 righteous there, 30, all the way down to 10? If there are 10 righteous there, the Lord is not going to destroy it. Well, obviously, the 10 could not be found. Genesis 19. The two angels, so apparently the Lord, and it does use, as I mentioned before in Genesis 18, it does use the divine name of God. Right? Sometimes Lord could be a translation of like Adoni, right? My Lord, or Adon, meaning Lord, which could be just be a person, right? Just a master. But when you see Lord in all caps, what's going on in the Hebrew is Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, right? The divine name, and it's none other than God. That name is explicit for him. And we see that name in Genesis 18. God is speaking with Abraham, right? There's no getting around it. God came and ate with Abraham. God speaks with Abraham. Abraham intercedes for the hypothetical righteous that might be in Sodom and Gomorrah. And this, of course, helps counter the attacks that we often get from people. How could God become a man, right? Well, we see foreshadowings of it in the Torah and in the Tanakh, and we see it definitely there in Genesis 18. But anyway, that's not the main thrust of today's talk. So the Lord stays behind as Abraham's interceding for the hypothetical righteous that might be there. And the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords," and there it's not all caps, right? So it's not the divine name. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. So there you see right there, there's not the 10 righteous. It's all of them, right? To the last man, it says. They surrounded Lot's house, and they came to Lot. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Right? Well, you know what it's saying there, right? Terrible stuff. Terrible, perverse stuff. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please." So this is not so great either. I mean, that's an understatement, obviously. This is also horrible, Lot's idea.
Yeah, for these strangers that just showed up. Imagine the daughter's point of view.
Yeah, I know.
After all these years, and then some strangers show up that need protection.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy. It's crazy. "Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." So it was in those days that if somebody came to you as a visitor, you were responsible for their protection, right? This was an important thing in the ancient world, but to go to the extent where you're willing to sacrifice your daughters is just crazy. But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge." Right? Isn't that often what happens when you stand for righteousness? Although, like I said, Lot's solution here is terrible, but still, there's some sense of righteousness here, at least as in regards to the messengers, the angels of the Lord. And when you stand up for righteousness, that's often what you'll get called, is a judge, right? But you got to stand up for truth, right? Lot's not judging anybody. He's just standing up for what's right, sort of. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men, the angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord." Okay, before Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. "And the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought him out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city is Zoar," which means little. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities in the valley and all the inhabitants of the city and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. All right. The first thing I want to discuss is going to be brief because I'm not an expert in this area, and it's not the main point of today's discussion, but it's just the question: have we found, has archaeology found Sodom and Gomorrah? And there are a lot of archaeologists saying yes, not all of them, right? Some of them say, well, the timing's a little off or whatever, but there are counter arguments for that as well. But there are, now that it's assumed that where Sodom and Gomorrah was on the south side of the Dead Sea, and that it used to be covered with water, and now it's not. And so there are the remnants of 2 cities there that look like they really could be Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reason why is twofold. One is that it's in the right, threefold. One is that it's in the right location. The other is that there are signs of the Genesis 14 scenario of the kings coming against them. And the third is that after the signs of that warfare of Genesis 14 that we read about, there's signs of the cities being burned, just utterly destroyed by fire. And so I encourage you to look that up. I'm not an expert in that area. I'm not saying it's 100% for sure, but when I read the articles about it, it certainly sounds like they found Sodom and Gomorrah, and that the ash left there by the burning fits the way that the Bible describes their overflow. So if you are interested in that, the modern names for those ruins are in Arabic, Bab ed Dra. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not. I don't know anything about Arabic. And the other, Numera, okay, which is similar to Gomorrah, right? And it starts with an N instead of the G sound, but those guttural sounds sometimes transferred over the years. So the G and the N are actually not that far apart, okay? And we see this to this day a little bit, those guttural sounds. And like what we call Gaza, Israel calls Aza, okay? Because that silent letter at the beginning of Aza probably used to have more of a guttural G sound. So our Gaza is probably closer to the ancient name of the city, whereas Aza is more modern Hebrew. So anyway, that's just a little side note that I found interesting. Next thing I want to get into is, why is the story here? Lots of things happened in the ancient world. Most things did not make it into the Bible. We have large years and years of Abraham's life where we know nothing about it, right? Years and years of all kinds of things going on that we know nothing about. Why is this in the Bible? And I think one of those reasons is for Israel to understand that when they come out of Egypt and they go into the land of Canaan, this is why some of those cities need to be utterly destroyed, because of how terrible it can get. Deuteronomy 12, verse 29. Twelve 29 through 31 says this: when the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess. So this is Moses speaking to the people, God speaking to the people through Moses. After they've come out of Egypt, they're in the desert, they're about to go into the land of Canaan, which will become the land of Israel. When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, that I also may do the same? You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Right? So Sodom and Gomorrah is a poignant picture of the power of sin and how it takes over. Notice what it said. Every man, every single one of them surrounded the house to rape these angels from the Lord. Right? This is terrible, terrible stuff. And I think that part of the reason that it's here, because you have to think about it. If these are the books of Moses, right? If Moses is the one that collected these stories. Now, there were other editors and so forth. The text bears that out. But I do think that the Torah has its roots in Moses and in that time period. And so why is Moses relating these stories to the people of Israel? And I think that's one of them, right? Look at what sin can lead to. Look at why these cities in this land that you're going into to inhabit need to be utterly cut off, because it can get this bad. And it can be a snare to you. Okay? The second thing is not just dealing with the evil of other cities, but the potential for evil within our own selves and within Israel. If we'll go back a chapter in Deuteronomy Chapter 12, starting at verse 29. No. Where am I? I meant to... yeah, I did it backwards. Okay, that's the one I meant to read now, but I read earlier. The one against the Canaanites is chapter 13, verse 12. No, I have it backwards. I had it right the first time. Forgive me. All right, so we are now in Deuteronomy chapter 13. Okay, so ignore the last 30 seconds of my rambling. Chapter 13, verse 12. If you hear in one of your cities, so now all of a sudden God's not talking about the evil of the Canaanites. God's talking about an evil happening within Israel itself. If you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to dwell there, that certain worthless fellows have gone out among you and have drawn away the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you have not known, then you then you shall inquire and make search and ask diligently. And behold, if it is true and certain that such an abomination has been done among you, you shall surely put the inhabitants of that city to the sword, devoting it to destruction, all who are in it and its cattle with the edge of the sword. You shall gather all its spoil into the midst of its open square, and burn the city and all its spoil with fire, as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. It shall be a heap forever. It shall not be rebuilt. It's got to be done away with, like Sodom and Gomorrah. Now imagine the Lord saying that. It adds so much more, such an understanding of the dire need to get rid of this sin if you have Sodom and Gomorrah in your head. If we don't take care of this, that sin is going to grow and grow, to the point where even angels from God are fair game for men's lust, to the point where it's going to spread to other cities. We cannot become that. Then the Lord will overthrow us. If we don't excise this sin now, if we don't get rid of it now ourselves, then the Lord will take care of it in judgment, the way he took care of it in judgment with Sodom and Gomorrah. Does that make sense? So I feel like there are other things going on here, such as Abraham's, like we talked about last week, Abraham's learning to intercede and so forth. God's righteous judgment, right? Did God actually have to send angels there? Doesn't God know everything? But God sending angels there to inspect is a way of saying that God is careful in his judgment. He's not haphazard. Just like he comes down to inspect the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. He comes down, he speaks with Abraham, sends the angels on to Sodom. God is careful in his judgment. These are all themes that we can learn from this, but I think primarily it's the destructive power of sin. These Canaanite cities, Israel, have to be destroyed. They have to be done away with. Because if not, it's going to get worse and worse, and it's going to spread to you like gangrene. That's the way sin works. Next question. Okay, so we've asked the question, why is it here? Next question, how does it point to Yeshua? Right? It's pretty easy. It talks about, it reveals how dreadful sin is, that it requires drastic measures. Sin requires drastic measures to be taken care of. I am, as I've mentioned before, in a debate group online. I've been spending less time on there lately, and I'm much happier. But one of the things that we've been discussing, or have discussed in the past, is this idea of why did God have to why did Yeshua have to be punished in order for us to be forgiven? And maybe punished is the wrong word, but why did he have to bear the consequences of our sin in order for there to be forgiveness? Can't God just forgive? Right? That's the counter argument from my interlocutors. Can't God just forgive? Well, the reason they're saying that is because they have such a low view of sin, and they really do. Right? It's not such a big deal. Don't worry about it too much. These are Jewish people saying this, and the reason they're saying this is because they don't know their Bibles that well, or not as well as they think they do. Throughout the entire Bible, sin is treated with the utmost seriousness. It's treated with the utmost seriousness. That's why we have the sacrifices. That's why we have Canaanite cities being overthrown. That's why we have rebellious children being commanded to be stoned. Whether that actually happened or not, I don't know. But regardless, we're dealing with serious stuff here. Sin, sin is rebellion against the Most High. And when you have a low view of sin, it means you have a low view of God. Right? If I let my manners go a little bit in front of my pets, not a big deal, right? I'm slurping from my soup bowl, right? Not a big deal, okay? In front of my wife, maybe a little less appropriate there, right? I should honor her by having good manners in front of her, right? But, if you're sitting with royalty, not that you should think of royalty as more important than your spouse, but there's a certain dignified aura there, right? You're going to be careful. Am I using the right spoon even and such, right? So the more dignified you see as the person sitting across from you, the more dignified you want to be. And when you are aware of God's glory and God's power and God's righteousness, in Him is light and there's no darkness at all, and you're overwhelmed, all of a sudden sin is like a really big deal. If you have a low view of sin, it's because you have a low view of God. Isaiah chapter 6, first 5 chapters of Isaiah, we don't hear anything about Isaiah repenting for his own sin. But as soon as he's in that vision where he sees God on the throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and the angels are crying, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. All of a sudden he's aware of God's glory, and what does he say? Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell amongst the people of unclean lips, and my eyes have beheld the King of glory, or whatever he calls God there, right? All of a sudden he's got this tremendous vision of who God is, and he's totally aware of his sin. Sin is terrible, and you understand the terribleness of it, the dreadfulness of it, when you understand the glory of God. And when you understand the glory of God and the dreadfulness of sin, you realize that something drastic needs to be done to take care of this. Either an utter destruction or some major type of act so that forgiveness can actually be dispensed while still upholding God's righteousness and God's justice. Paul talks about this in Romans. I'm not going to go down that path because it would be a sermon in and of itself. But Paul's concern in the book of Romans for the first few chapters is the manifestation of the righteousness of God. And he's saying through the sacrifice of Yeshua, by receiving forgiveness in this manner, God's righteousness is manifest. He's dealt with sin in a way in which God's righteousness is maintained, His justice is maintained, His glory is maintained. Sin needs to be dealt with, and it can be dealt with either through our destruction or in the way that God dealt with it through Yeshua. That's how this points us to Yeshua. It's not a direct prophecy. I can't read this and come up with a theory of Yeshua just from reading this, but I can see that sin is terrible and it needs to be dealt with. And then I look at Yeshua, That's how it's dealt with. I don't have to become like Sodom and Gomorrah. I see the glory of God. Like Isaiah, I'm aware of my own sin, my own dreadfulness. And like it says in Isaiah 6, right, the call is taken from the altar. It touches Isaiah's lips. This has touched your lips. You're made clean. In the presence of God, I need to be made clean. So we get to choose our own destruction because of sin, or taking upon ourselves through faith in him the righteousness that comes because he, Yeshua, bore the consequences of our sin. That was the second question. I'm going to do one more. So the first question, why is it here? Right? It reveals the dreadfulness of sin. Secondly, how does it point us to Yeshua? In its revealing of the dreadfulness of sin, we understand that a dramatic remedy is needed. Right? It's not just God waving his hand. It's forgiven. Too much has been done to diminish the glory of God through sin. Not that his glory itself is diminished, but the manifestation, the message of that glory is diminished. And when you understand your role as one who is here to be the image of God, to spread the glory of God on the earth, and instead of doing that, you've soiled his name, and I've soiled his name through our sin, that needs to be remedied. And it's remedied by putting our trust in Yeshua, who bore the penalty for our sin, and who rightly glorified God in doing so. Last question that I want to deal with, and then I'll open it up for questions or comments or discussion. The last question is this. If we know the destructiveness of sin, how are we to deal with this? What is the right way of God working in our lives to get it gone? For that, I'd like us to turn to James chapter 1, verse 12. Through 15. James 1, 12 through 15. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Okay, and we see this in Genesis over and over, right? We saw it with the forbidden fruit, right? There's a desire there within Eve, unstated, but it's obviously there because the temptation brings it out. There's desire plus temptation leads to sin. Sin leads to death. In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Now, if you want to say, well, they entered into a mortal state at that time, or they spiritually died, in some way or some ways, it led to death. Desire plus temptation leads to death. We see it with Cain and Abel, right? Cain has a desire. We don't quite know what's going on there, but in some way, Abel's sacrifice is being accepted and not his. He has a desire to be the favorite or whatever it might be. And God warns him, temptation is at the door, right? Desire plus temptation leads to sin, and that sin led to death. In that case, it led to the death of his victim, Abel. And it's the same thing here, right, with Sodom and Gomorrah. The root of it is they have a desire. the angels come along, there's the temptation, and it leads to death. It leads to sin, and the sin leads to death. That's what James is saying here. Each person is tempted, so we have temptation when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. We have temptation and desire together. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Now there are four places here to beg for God to intercede. Okay? And we've done them all. Okay? I'm going to end with the most ideal one. Okay? I'm going to kind of work backwards here. The sin leads to death. That's the last step, right? Desire and temptation leads to sin. Sin leads to death. So that last step, we intercede after the sin. Don't let me die. Right? I had the desire. The temptation came along. It bred sin. I deserve to die. Now, you may have put yourself in a situation in which you will genuinely die, possibly, or in which some terrible thing will happen to you, or maybe it's just, Lord, don't take your spirit from me. Don't let me have a spiritual death here. We get to that point and we have to beg for that. Lord, I follow that path. Temptation and desire, sin, and now I deserve to die. Don't let me die. Right? Better to take a step back. I have desire and temptation. Don't let me sin. Right? That's an earlier step. It's better to intercede at that point before you actually do the sin. I've got the desire. Here's the temptation. Don't let me sin. Okay? Let's say that a guy goes to the beach and there's girls there dressed in next to nothing. Right? And the desire's there and the temptation is there. Lord, help me not to sin. Right? Help me to have self-control here and not to look at these girls in an inappropriate way. Right? Or whatever it might be. Right? Maybe your sin is food. I have the desire for food. I walked into a chocolate cake factory. Lord, help me not to sin and overindulge. Okay? If you do overindulge, Lord, help me not to have the heart attack or whatever, right? And that would be the last step that I talked about earlier. Save me from death. How about earlier? Save me from sin, right? There's an earlier step. Keep me from temptation. And we see that in the Lord's Prayer, don't we? Lead us not into temptation. And there are guys, going back to my analogy of the guy at the beach, there are guys who won't go to the beach. Let me avoid the temptation. I think that's a better step. That's an earlier step. You know? Right? Or if chocolate cake is your nemesis, you don't go into the chocolate cake store. You know? You avoid the temptation. Lord, lead me not into temptation. That's an even better step. Get it earlier. But I think the best step is the earliest one. Lord, change my desire. Change my desire. Romans 8. Starting right at the beginning. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Messiah Yeshua. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Messiah Yeshua from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirements of the law or Torah, you could read there, might be fulfilled in us who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh, listen to this, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. You have to have a new mind. What's your mind set on? And you see what he's saying? This was impossible just under Torah. Right? We needed Messiah for this kind of transformation. To put to death the desires, to put to death the flesh, the mindset on the flesh, requires the work of the Messiah and the Spirit in our life. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Now, you could be in the flesh, you could have those desires, and through self-control, amazing amounts of self-control, you avoid the beach, you avoid the chocolate cake store, whatever it might be, right? There are those who are have homosexual desire, but they say, for the sake of God's glory and my obedience to Him, I will not indulge. And I'm impressed by those people. I think that's great. But I do think that there is a place in union with Yeshua through the Spirit in which our very desires can change. And if we can get to that level, Lord, change my desire, then we don't even start out on that path. Desire plus temptation gives birth to sin and leads to death. Well, let me take a step back. Lord, I sinned. Don't let me die. I'm sorry. Well, let me take a step back from that. Let me not even, I've got the desire, the temptation's there, but somehow, Lord God, keep me from the sin. It's tough, right? I've been there before, and we've all been there before. The desire is raging inside of you. The temptation is there, and we sometimes succeed and we sometimes fail. Lord, help me not to sin. The desire's there. Okay, take a step back. What about here? I've got the desire, but I'm not going to go to where that desire might be fulfilled. I've got the wrong desire. Let me avoid it. Today I'm feeling weak, so I'm not even going to open up the computer because there's no telling where I might go, right? Or people throwing their computers away and stuff like that. Great, great. You're avoiding the temptation, but what about even a step back from that? Lord, by your Spirit and the sacrifice of your Son, give me your desires so I don't even start out on that path. I want to love what you love, and I want to hate what you hate. I want to see things the way that you see them instead of through my fleshly eyes. Rearrange even my desires. What does Hebrews chapter 9 say? 13 and 14. Verses 13 and 14, it says, for if the ashes, or if bulls and goats and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of an heifer purify for the sanctification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God, right? So this sacrifice goes even deeper. It can purge your very conscience so that all of a sudden your conscience, not just your outward actions, but your very conscience is transformed by God so that you love what he loves and you hate what he hates. Whatever step you're at, there's Yeshua all over it, right? Lord, I have sinned. Don't let it lead to death. By the sacrifice of my Son, God says, who took on death for you, I will forgive you. You can have life, right? Yeshua's in that step. Don't get there. Try not to get there, right? Let's go back a step. But if you do, it's the grace of the Lord keeping you alive, because sin leads to death. Lord, I've got the desire, and here I am right where those temptations are. Don't let me sin. Yeshua's got to be in that step, right? Yeshua's got to, Lord, let me look to his example and live the way that he lived, right? Or, Lord, lead me not into temptation. The desire's still there right now, but Lord God, lead me not into temptation, right? Walk as Yeshua leads. But Lord, help us to get to that earliest step where even the desire is transformed, where we love the things that you love and where we hate the things that you hate. And this happens only, it says right here in Romans 8, that now Messiah has done that something even the law could not do, even the Torah could not do. It's been done now in Yeshua, that we can be dead to the old as we are unified in his crucifixion. And we can be alive in the new as we are unified with his resurrection. Right? Romans 5:6. Lord God, bring us to that place. It's all predicated on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Without stories like this, we wouldn't take it so seriously. Or the story of Isaiah before the Lord in Isaiah chapter 6. Without an understanding of the glory of the Lord, we wouldn't take these things seriously. Let's take them seriously. Sin is dreadful. It leads to death. Right? It's not just that you are forgiven. It's not just that you are forgiven. It's that you can be transformed by the power of the Spirit. All right? Anybody